Hi everyone. So today I was watching a movie and it was a movie set in India and it was about the struggles of individuals of lower castes in functioning and living with dignity in Indian society. And that got me thinking, how is India different from Sri Lanka? See, ever since I was a young person, I've always faced a question where people would ask me constantly whether India and Sri Lanka were the same thing. Or I remember once where somebody said, India and Sri Lanka, isn't that pretty much the same country? Aren't they just similar culturally? And for many of us Sri Lankans, the answer has always been no, of course not. Sri Lanka and India are different countries. But I've always found that it's been very difficult to summarize why our countries are so different to people at any given moment. So today I decided I was going to make a short video on how you can very easily describe how Sri Lanka is distinctly different to India in three very, very important ways. First, Sri Lanka doesn't have a functioning caste system. Although some communities may try and practice caste discrimination, in reality Sri Lanka has no overriding caste system. There are no places in Sri Lanka where you might actually find people differentiating people across castes or any actual functioning way through which people can tell what another person's caste is. Sri Lankans can't tell their caste apart by name, by region that they live in, by religious affiliation or anything like that. Caste systems are non-existent in Sri Lanka. And it certainly isn't at all applicable in Sri Lanka to be able to discriminate across castes. For example, you would never be able to tell this person's caste or indeed to treat somebody badly in terms of caste. If you compare that to India, India has a huge issue with intercaste discrimination. And these aren't simple cases of people just not wanting to talk to each other or interacting with each other. Intercaste marriage is often frowned upon and violently interfered with. It is not uncommon for individuals of lower castes to be murdered or to be denied access to services based on their caste. In India, it isn't uncommon for individuals from lower castes to be attacked physically and verbally, denied access to shops, not being physically interacted with, not being allowed to attend educational institutions, and indeed it isn't uncommon for individuals of lower caste to be subjected to much higher rates of murder, assault, sexual assault, and other crimes. The caste system, the discrimination it brings, causes untold suffering in India. And there's huge amounts of film, media, books, literature, articles, and interviews that you can look at online which describe the misery that the unjust system of caste discrimination forces on people in India. And the fact that this is completely unfathomable to Sri Lankans is, to my mind, a good thing. In Sri Lanka, this would be unthinkable. There would be no way of justifying such a thing on the basis of caste differences. And so there is a sense of equality amongst people in Sri Lanka that doesn't exist in India. Secondly, Sri Lanka has a very different attitude towards women. You see, Sri Lanka is actually one of the most matrilineal cultures in South Asia. And by South Asia, I mean as far west as Afghanistan and as far east as Myanmar. In Sri Lanka, it isn't unusual for women to finish school. It is also entirely normal in Sri Lanka for women to be considered literate. It isn't unusual in Sri Lanka for women to take a leading role in managing a household as well as a family and its finances. It isn't unusual in Sri Lanka for girls and boys in the same family to be educated. In fact, it isn't even a discussion. It is assumed that if one educates their children, they will educate all their children. Children's education isn't segregated based on their gender. It is not normal in Sri Lanka to celebrate the birth of a son as compared to the birth of a daughter. Female infanticide is unheard of in Sri Lanka. So in India, women are often subjected to lots of different societal pressures, and one important one is that having a daughter is seen as quite shameful. Now, in Sri Lanka, that concept doesn't exist. There is no shame in having a son or a daughter. Children are often considered equal in terms of their gender value. This issue is so intense in India that women often need to selectively abort their female child, which has led to a massive number of gender selective abortions, which has been rectified by the Indian government, at least by banning gender testing before birth. These issues just don't exist in Sri Lanka. And although a lot needs to be changed in terms of gender equality, the general state of misogyny and subjugation of women is much lower in Sri Lanka. And evidence for this is things like the fact that in a Sri Lankan household, women often manage finances, and women often don't take their husband's surname. And then there is the matter of literacy. Sri Lanka has a very high level of literacy, which is almost even between men and women. So somewhere between 92 to 96% equally distributed levels of literacy among men and women. If you compare that to India, India has a huge discrepancy between men's and women's literacy. Indian women are often subjected to huge amounts of physical, verbal, and sexual harassment. It is uncommon for Indian women to have autonomy. Indian women's education significantly lags behind men's education, although that is changing now. In terms of education, whilst most of the world began proper women's education in structural terms in the 40s and 50s and so on, Sri Lanka has secondary schools for girls going as far back as the 1800s. Sri Lanka has a long history of educating women because intrinsically in Sri Lankan culture, women and women's education is seen as an important part of society and an important part of normal life. And then thirdly, Sri Lanka has a completely different culture to India, as well as completely different languages and ethnic groups. Now, India is a very diverse place. There's hundreds of languages and hundreds of different communities, and that's wonderful. But Sri Lanka, despite being a tiny little island, has tens of ethnic groups and tens of languages, and many people in Sri Lanka speak 2 to 3 languages, right? And this diversity, the ethnic and cultural diversity in Sri Lanka is of a different mix than the ethnic and cultural mix in India. So, for example, Sri Lanka has a strong Portuguese, Dutch, and British influence in our culture. There is also a strong Irish influence. Many of Sri Lanka's private schools and education institutions were set up by Irish nuns. Sri Lanka has a significant and intact Adivasi community. Our indigenous Vanyaleta have been there for 50,000 years or more, and their language and culture remains intact. And that lends a difference to our culture because the indigenous people of Sri Lanka and their languages have no known root language and no known root connection to other languages from the Indian subcontinent. Sri Lankans also have other communities like the Malay community, the Afro-Sri Lankan community, as well as various other communities like the Arab Sri Lankan community, the Moorish community, Persian Sri Lankans, Khojas, Parsis, Bohras, and so on. And our unique mix is distinctly different to the mix of India. Sri Lankans also don't commonly speak Hindi, which is often something that people are saying about Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka does share some languages in common with India, such as certain types of Tamil. But even there, Sri Lankan Tamil and the types of Tamil in Sri Lanka differ from the types of Tamil in India. Sri Lankan food is distinctly different too, because Sri Lanka has a very different kind of cultural and ethnic mix. Sri Lankan food is often a combination of this particular mix that is unique to the maritime Silk Route, and that mix differentiates it from Indian food. A simple example would be the fact that in Sri Lanka we tend to use whole spices and not masalas, which are often ground spices. Or that Sri Lanka has a lot of Malay food, for example. And I made a video about that as well. Sri Lanka has lots of Malay foods because of our strong Malay influence from Indonesia and the Malay archipelago, right? So culturally, Sri Lanka is very different to India. We are also linguistically different. And to me, these 3 differences, the fact that we don't have a caste system, the fact that Sri Lanka has much more equal relations between men and women, and the fact that Sri Lankans don't have a similar cultural, language, ethnic mix and food to India is what I think makes Sri Lanka distinctly different to India. Now, none of this is to say that I am insulting or mocking people from India. All I'm saying is that these distinct differences make Sri Lankans struggle to relate to many people in India. These topics I talked about are often the basis upon which people live their lives in some places, and the assumptions that come with them color the way we see the world. And because Sri Lanka is so intrinsically different to India in terms of our cultural orientation in the ways I've mentioned, you will often find that Sri Lankans don't often relate to Indian people. And that's okay. So the next time someone tells you India and Sri Lanka, what's the difference? You've got 3 points you can always use. And maybe it'll lead to an interesting discussion. But for now, I hope this video has been useful. If you like watching this kind of content, you want to learn more about Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan culture, history, and other concepts about Sri Lanka, please subscribe to Mateo Project on YouTube, on Facebook, on TikTok, and please like and follow our content. Thank you very much for watching.